Good morning, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Society of Schenectady. I am Tom Comparin. He, him pronouns work for me, and I am serving as worship associate today alongside Geoff Lundy. Any pronouns work for them. Wherever you are in your journey of finding truth and meaning, whether you arrive joyous or with a heavy heart, we are grateful that you have chosen to be here this morning.
Last Saturday, many in our country celebrated the 250th anniversary of our declaring our independence from British rule. Independence, which was won 7 years later, but the battle for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all in our country continues. This morning, we kindle our chalice with these words from Philip Randall Giles. We kindle this flame. We kindle this flame as a symbol of the light we would keep glowing in our lives, of appreciation for those who differ, loving kindness for those who suffer, esteem for all who remind us of our heritage and calling as agents of the Most High.
I didn't grow up with a bevy of aunts and uncles nearby, but I did have a large nuclear family, 5 children. My father, an ambitious young engineering professor, often brought work home, but before heading to his study, he always watched the national news. Time with Dad was scarce. At about 10 years old, that would have been around 1968, 69, I became a regular viewer of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. Perhaps some of you remember his nightly sign-off catchphrase, "And that's the way it is." I was a good student in high school, especially in history, or rather social studies as it was called then. I'm actually not really sure what they call it now. Um, it would not have been an exaggeration to say that I got the highest grade in the class on every history quiz and test that I took from 6th grade on. It was an eventful time in which to grow up for us history nerds, the kids attending those model state legislatures and model United Nations. The civil rights movement, women's rights, the Vietnam War protests and political assassinations, Watergate, the Cold War, the population explosion. But there was much other material to cover in American history, and our classes never quite got to the present day issues tearing apart and reforming the world. The Supreme Court ordered schools to be desegregated. Martin Luther King had a dream. America was back on track. The end of history. Perhaps some of you had similar experiences in school, in history class. My schools had their shortcomings, as do all, and their strengths as well. And I do have sympathy. Our schools are charged with the dual, often incompatible responsibilities of enlightenment and indoctrination, and nowhere more so than in history class. In junior year, I asked one of the high school history teachers if I might sit in on one of his classes during my free period just to observe. Yeah, I was that kid in school. I was curious about why others found history or found it less fascinating than I did, and just about how school worked in general. It was an odd request, I'm sure, likely one that may have happened only that once, but he couldn't find a reason to say no to me. And so I sat and observed. The young teacher was energetic. The textbook was new. It had these little interesting, like, facts boxes, the stuff you didn't actually have to know for the test. It was supposed to intrigue us. But boy, in the end, were the students bored. Irrespective of textbook enhancements and teacher enthusiasms, the unmistakable underlying message of the lessons was that America today was the providentially inevitable pinnacle of all human effort. Whatever you think of the accuracy of that message, It made for a boring story. We all knew the end. The evening news, back during the height of the Vietnam War, seemed to always feature a casualty count, showing the number of combatants killed in action. Even to my 10-year-old self, the numbers were puzzlingly lopsided. So many more enemy deaths. I wondered how in the world the war could still be going on. Only later did we learn of the fraud and misguided strategies that led to those cruel, fictitious numbers. Only later did we learn. Only later did we learn. Despite all the A's earned, I never during those school years learned to think like a historian. Never learned to separate correlation from causality, never learned to systematically probe with deeper questions. Only later, reading primary sources and genuine scholarly works, I did begin to escape the simplified narrative of America's inevitable grandeur, to see some of the nuance and complexity that render the world of today. Now, I've been, as I just testified to, a lifelong news junkie, a subscriber to liberal magazines, for 20 years a resident of a mixed Manhattan neighborhood. Back then, my social circle ran from corporate lawyers to drag queens. I worked in restaurants and corporate offices. I worked in Harlem preparing taxes. Certain contradictions of American life continued to puzzle me. But I thought by middle age that I had a fairly clear understanding of America, warts and all. And then my wife and I moved upstate and we joined this church. And slowly I began to learn that I had a lot more to learn. It's kind of funny thinking back about it now. I don't know what others of you thought might happen to you when you joined a church or came here. I thought it would be community, spiritual growth, perhaps. I didn't really expect that it would challenge my fundamental beliefs about the world and myself, and how much I could be changed by this place. One summer, while attending a week at Ferry Beach, the UU Camp Conference Center in Maine, I took a week-long workshop called Building the World We Dream About, led by the author of the program, Dr. Mark Hicks. It must have been about 14 years ago, long enough ago that terminology such as BIPOC, white supremacy culture, anti-blackness, white fragility, decentering whiteness, these terms were not widely used yet, although the ideas were addressed in the workshop. I would like to tell you that the workshop was a big aha moment for me, but in truth, I didn't get it. I was still very much in my super logical, critical, yeah, but I don't think so, what about, I know better mode. I wasn't ready yet to challenge my biases, challenge a view of the world I had inherited unknowingly. I confessed as much to Mark when I met him a few years later, but I also shared that his lessons had stayed with me, seeds growing slowly, stubbornly, pushing through layers of accumulated cultural mulch. Those seeds were nourished here at UUSS. I took more workshops, participated in common reads, listened to sermons and testimonies from this pulpit, from ministers and lay members, arguing, debating, puzzling over questions with many of you. After the election of 2016, many of us were eager to jump into anti-racism and social justice work. Fortunately, our ministers guided us through a period of congregational self-reflection and assessment, exploring our own biases and misperceptions. A personal milestone occurred for me in 2019 when I read Ibram Kendi's National Book Award winning work, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Several of us here were reading it, And I agreed to lead a workshop to present and summarize the book. I remember Mark Hyland, remember now, ancestor, who had also read it, smiling at me at coffee hour and telling me he would attend the workshop just to see how I was going to summarize a 500-page work and 400 years of history in two 90-minute sessions. Kendi's work is challenging. Without all of my UU pre-work and a commitment to master his ideas well enough to present them, I likely once again would not have gotten it. And it was a big commitment. I read that book twice. I took detailed notes, and I just would not have had that commitment without it being a part of the efforts of this community. It really pushed me and challenged me being here with you. One of Kendi's main insights is what we might call the ignorance and hate folklore of American racism. A common misperception, one that I shared, says ignorant and hateful people produced racist ideas, and these racist people instituted racist policies. But this has it backwards. Kendi's work documents how the racist policies came first. The racist ideas were cooked up later to justify them. The folklore I had learned, ignorance and hate lead to racist ideas, leads to discrimination, is largely ahistorical. It has actually been the reverse, the inverse relationship. Racial discrimination leads to racist ideas, leads to ignorance and hate. This is the causal relationship driving America's history of race relations. For me, this was a very different way of understanding American history. Some people argue that we should not focus too much on the sins of the past, that this will somehow diminish or sully our national pride and resolve. But that is a false and tragic argument. Hearing the full story will engage us, will strengthen our pride and resolve and our compassion. Our founders were not gods. They were mortals, as are we, flawed and complex. What pride should I have for the author of the Declaration of Independence if he were some otherworldly Superman? Despite his many flaws, Thomas Jefferson was still capable of penning a transformative document, of inscribing words so powerful that they would help motivate others to accomplish what he himself could not. That full story is a fascinating story. And what of the generational journeys of African Americans through suffering and oppression and seemingly endless struggles, so much resilience and joy and accomplishment? Is there any chapter of the American story more inspiring? But the myth that I have grappled with most, struggled most to overcome, is not one born solely of any whitewashed history. Rather, it is an odd hybrid, a mix of the idea of American exceptionalism and, let's say, liberal optimism. It is a belief that the work of justice can be finished, that a promised land can be reached once and for all. My generation saw civil rights laws passed, saw the Vietnam War end, women's rights expand. The path seemed so clear. We just needed to continue spreading the good word, burying ignorance and hate with education and love. But history teaches a different lesson. As Kendi shows, discrimination springs from economic, political, and cultural self-interests, and those self-interests are constantly changing. Greed can be suppressed but not vanquished. In hard times, scapegoats will be sought. Deflecting blame will be cast upon others. Oppression will raise its head, whisper ugly lies, seeking to spread again through the world, to enrich the few and impoverish the many. As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to be ever vigilant. We are called to embrace the struggle for justice and to acknowledge that this struggle will be ongoing. The arc of history may bend toward justice, but only as long as pressure is maintained. Here in this spiritual place, we sometimes find ourselves talking about history, I guess like today, and about climate science and politics and racism and patriarchy. We grant time and energy to these earthly subjects because the world today is filled with myth and misinformation, and because the lens of UU values and principles and practices can help us penetrate the fog and mists of myth and can help us see the world more fully and clearly. And this clarity may empower us to be more generous, more compassionate, and better able to effectively fight for justice, to build the world we dream about. And that's the way it is.
Oh, yeah, Tom and I are of a similar age and growing up through the same times. It's very much a shared story. From my earliest recollections, my father told us that our great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee. This was confirmed by most of my paternal relatives. I enthusiastically embraced this lineage. There are few anecdotal stories that enhance the probability that it was true, even a treasured heirloom passed from father to son, now in the possession of my older brother. I like to joke with those who claim that their ancestors came over on the Mayflower that my people, a bit of a stretch, were there to meet them. Several years ago, a younger brother and sister sent DNA samples to 2 different labs to trace our ancestry. The results were virtually identical. 50% came from the German-speaking cantons of Switzerland. That's my mom's people, who moved into the valleys of Pennsylvania 330 years ago, and some are still there. I was born there. 48% came from Northern Ireland and Scotland. That's Dad's side, Patricks, Lovetts, Caudells, and Lundys. 2%, indeterminate, probably Scandinavian. Well, the Vikings raided the Irish and Scottish coasts and gave their name to Normandy. No native DNA. I'm a descendant of pasty white European immigrants. Notwithstanding this evidence, some of my siblings believe that somewhere in that indeterminate DNA there is a Cherokee woman hiding. I think it's a good lesson and a very human trait to cling dearly to straws when long-held and beloved myths are debunked. In school, I too learned American history. Columbus discovers America. No mention made of enslaving the people that he met. The conquistadors brutally conquered Central and South America, but that wasn't really our heritage. Jamestown, with the melodramatic scenes of Pocahontas, Powhatan, and John Smith. Pilgrims landing at Plymouth met by the helpful Massasoit. The larger-than-life founding fathers with the Great Experiment, the American Revolutionary War, and a new kind of government. Daniel Boone, killing bears and opening the Cumberland Gap. Davy Crockett, killing bears and dying heroically at the Alamo. Paul Bunyan, with Babe the Blue Ox, chopping down trees. The stories just kept adding up, and any unpleasantness that occurred was smoothed over by, it was just the times they lived in. It happened long ago and cannot be undone. Let's just move on. As Tom stated, I was indoctrinated. In hindsight, that seems incredible. I had protested, wrote letters, didn't trust my political leaders, and yet I bought into the narrative that overall we were the good guys, and inexorably we turned even missteps to the greater good, despite daily evidence that that might not be the case. After I moved from my sheltered central Pennsylvania homeland, 99.6% white, to the metro New York area, I met a lot of people who didn't look like, speak like, or think quite the way I did. As I interacted with these newer immigrants and native peoples, I came to understand that their view of America was different from mine. I got a glimpse of America through their eyes. We weren't always the good guys. Sometimes we were the villains. I began to see America in a new and uncomfortable light. Let's take a brief, less lighthearted look at some of the myths and legends I mentioned earlier. At least 41 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned enslaved people. 27 of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention owned enslaved people. 9, possibly 10, of our first presidents owned enslaved people. George Washington, our first president, was a product of his time, the Age of Enlightenment. He came to understand as he grew older that slavery violated the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the spirit of the Constitution. He advocated for the gradual abolition of slavery and made provisions in his will to emancipate the 123 people he personally owned. After his death, when he had had full use of them and could no longer profit from them. He also vigorously pursued his runaways and utilized legal loopholes to prevent his enslaved people from gaining their freedom when they might have obtained it. The failure of our founding fathers and their successors to abolish slavery in America led to 83 more years of unimaginable abusive horror for millions of enslaved Black Americans. Then we fought a civil war and finally ended slavery in America. Hatred, fear, bigotry, and prejudice endure. That was just the way it was. It was long ago and cannot be undone. Let's just move on. Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, all joking aside, did kill a lot of bears. It was a highly profitable business enterprise which they and many others engaged in. They also both owned enslaved people. Davy Crockett was philosophically opposed to slavery, but he wasn't opposed to profiting by it. One of several reasons for the Texas Revolution of 1836 was that Mexico had abolished slavery and the Texan white owners were protesting their right to enslave people. William Travers and Jim Bowie, the commanders at the Alamo, owned enslaved people, and Davy Crockett sided with them. The battle at the Alamo was, in part, to defend slavery. Daniel Boone was hired to lead a team of 12 axemen, no Paul Bunyan, no blue ox of any color, name, to blaze and widen an existing Native American trail through the Cumberland Gap, known as the Wilderness Road, or Boone's Trace. This enabled more than 300,000 settlers to flow easily into western Kentucky, which already had an indigenous population, plus some of the indigenous refugees we had displaced from the original 13 colonies, now states. This, of course, led to new skirmishes, conflicts, all-out wars. This pattern repeats itself. We expel the native people, pushing them into new territories already occupied. Sometimes we negotiate a treaty to seal the deal. Then we take that land and push them into new, already occupied lands and repeat until we reach the Pacific Ocean and we ran out of continental lands to confiscate. That was just the way it was. It was long ago and it cannot be undone. Let's just move on. All of our country was once native territory. Now only a tiny percentage has been retained by the surviving tribes. How many tribes? How many people with their languages and cultures did we eradicate in our race to civilize the continent? When the native peoples lived here, they maintained a reasonably balanced ecological footprint. Their impact was subtle and, at least for the most part, repairable. There was no Paul Bunyan, but thousands and thousands of men with axes. Our explorers and settlers hunted and trapped out the game, cleared vast swatches of forest, and farmers tilled while ranchers pastured the landscape. We dammed the rivers, dug out the minerals, smoked the skies with the reeking factories of our industrial revolution. That's just the way it was. It was long ago and cannot be undone. Let's move on. Why is it important to get our history right or balanced? The same forces that operated at our founding and in our early years still operate today. If we don't know our mistakes, if we don't own our mistakes, we're doomed to repeat them. Right now, ICE and other government agencies are yanking people off the streets with no regard for their constitutionally guaranteed rights, no due process. They separate families and deport people to wherever we can send them. LGBTQ folks are being denied their right to live authentically, and our Supreme Court endorses this. That's not long ago. That's today. Our government speaks of annexing Greenland and maybe Canada, and who knows where else, not because those populations wish to become part of the United States of America, but because they are profitably exploitable. That's not long ago. That's today. We, the United States of America, kidnap or assassinate the leaders of other countries, bomb their cities, their people, and their infrastructures. The president has glibly spoken of eradicating the people of Iran, and we are aligned with a country seemingly bent on the genocide of the Palestinian people. That's not long ago. That's today. Our air is polluted, our water is polluted, our soil is polluted, our groundwater is polluted. We find microplastics everywhere, in our food and in us. Everything is contaminated. Our government's response is to loosen the restrictions on polluters and reduce all guidelines and oversight on environmental issues. They plan to take our green spaces, our parks, and our public lands and open those up to unregulated mining and drilling because it is profitably exploitable. That's not long ago. That's today. Our government wants to re-erect statues to the Confederacy, which is not surprising given that they pardon and want to reward the insurrectionists of January 6th, who attempted to overturn a duly constituted and constitutionally mandated election. That's not long ago. That's today. Our government wants to whitewash American history even more than it has been, to erase that we've made poor choices and the suffering those actions caused. They want to continue the myth that America is always right rather than allow us to admit our mistakes. They do not want us to examine how those mistakes happen and then learn to prevent us from repeating them. That's not long ago. That's today. In 125 years, when this congregation celebrates 250 years, we and our actions will be part of their myths and legends. So what can we do? Unitarians and Universalists were early advocates for human and humane rights. We as UUs still are. This congregation has advocacy programs, UU the Vote, Green Sanctuary Team, and the Social Justice Action Committee, just for starters. UUs participate in No King rallies, pride celebrations, and protesting ICE, among many other things. Join us. Show up. Be heard. Be seen. Contact your representatives and tell them to do their job. Hold them accountable for their actions. Vote for rational representatives who will do their job. Watch where you spend your money. If I get upset with a local chain store because they heavily supported some abominable candidate and quit buying coffee or an egg sandwich from them, they won't even know it happened. I feel good for a moment, but they don't know. Look at our history. Our founding fathers didn't win independence from one of the mightiest empires of the 18th century by individually contesting with them. They organized, had committees, they argued a lot, but they made plans and executed them. We have seen that well-organized boycotts can even get large corporations' attention. This takes organization, which takes people who show up and participate. Together, we can make a difference. So much of it has been damaged, some of it perhaps irreparably. But if we do nothing, this becomes just another, that's the time they lived in. It was long ago and cannot be changed moment. Together, we can change the story that will be told of our times. I close with a quote from James Baldwin from his collection of essays, Notes from a Native Son. I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for that reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually.